Good day, welcome back. Today I'm returning to my series on corresponding squares with something a little bit different where we look at a few real-world examples of corresponding squares. It's always good to do that from time to time just to realize that actually they can be pretty useful in your own games, mainly king and pawn endgames, although funnily enough we've got a rook endgame this time. And whilst corresponding squares is just this method for trying to solve these problems, it's very closely related to triangulation, opposition, and we'll sort of see that as we look at examples. Okay, so let's just quickly go to the capture screen. General reminder notes there on the side, which we might add to as we go along. I'm not actually going to look at 6 games, but I was going to look at 6 games originally. You can see there's Kasparov, Lev Albert, we'll look at. Kasparov, Seirawan, that one's pretty famous. And probably look at Tal versus Spassky. I've noticed with Henenberg and Nimzovich, which is an amazing game with a sort of a double triangulation in it. There's a very good video by Daniel King on that, so I might pass on that one. And the Adams game and the Botvinnik game as well. I mean, they're quite interesting. I just put them on that list, which I sort of came up with when you Google things like good examples of corresponding squares or triangulation or whatever, that the AI will come back with a list of games. And I've probably just focus on those 3 I've mentioned. A good example of how to use the technique in real world. And if you want to look at the other games at your leisure, or indeed look at the Daniel King video on Henneberger Nimzo, that'd be a really good thing to do. Okay, so let's have a look at these games one by one, just to see how corresponding squares can be used as a part of the solution of the endgame problem. Let's cross to the board. Now, this is interesting. It's from the 1978 USSR Championship semi-final between Lev Albert and Garry Kasparov. Now, Albert actually defected to the US in 1979, so he saw the writing on the wall with a very young Garry Kasparov. He's only 2200. If you look at that, I mean, you can't see it just with the PGN, which I leave off to the side. So you can see that he's 2200 at this stage, but he still managed to win this game. Now, this position, I believe, is a lot like Barney, Alapin, and so on. And actually, this position, you do a search with Scoutfish, it pops up quite a few times, and it's a classic triangulation / corresponding squares problem. And it's just good, just a bit of a revision to know how to solve this one. So let's go through the process again. I say, okay, what's the steps? Key squares. What are the key squares here? Well, I believe that is definitely a key square right there. If the black king gets to there, he's going to pick up the H pawn and then win quite comfortably. So white must stop black from getting to the G3 square. So that sort of helps us with our corresponding square arrangement. We can start plotting them in. If black gets to F4, then the only square that white must be on is F2. Now you can see that, arguably you could consider being on the H2 square to achieve the same thing, but then that doesn't work. Black will just run around to E3 and promote his F pawn, so that doesn't work. Right, so we've worked out the first pair of corresponding squares. Okay, so next let's do it a bit differently this time. Let's look at what happens if black gets to the E3 square. You shouldn't let him get to E3 squared, but if he does get to E3 square, where would white have to be? White would have to be on the E1 square. That's a standard position, so that black will either have to back off, or if he advances his pawn, then white would move in front of it, and then black would have, the only way to hold the pawn is to move to F3, and that would be stalemate. So that's why the E3 square corresponds to the E1 square, and now we can map the square marked 3, which is E4. So from E4, black can go to F4 or to E3, and there's only one square on the white side of the board, which allows the same situation, which is F1 square. If it was an F2, normally that would be a good defensive formation, but against a sort of a single fast pawn. But in this case, if he was on the F2 square, black would move to F1 and win the game. Right, so we've got a nice little pattern emerging there. So this is where we start to see the problem which black has, and we'll see that in the game continuation, is that now if you look behind the 1 and 3 square, black has 2 squares, E5 and F5, which both of those squares have access to the 1 and the 3 squares. And you can see that basically that's a triangulation possibility, because those 2 4 squares are actually, I don't have a double arrow, sorry, together. Move some of the color. You can see that what might happen here is that black will be able to go from one of the squares marked 4 to another square marked 4, and then come back to either a square marked 1 or a square marked 3, making a triangulation or some kind of strange open box formation. Now, what's white have on his side? He can't move to that square because it's covered by the black pawn. White only has G1, which allows him to go to the 1 and 3 square. He also has E1, but you notice the thing about those two squares is that they are not connected, and that's where black can do the triangulation and white ends up on the wrong square. So let's have a look at the continuation as played in the game. Let's go back. King F1 by white, so he moved on the corresponding square. Excellent. Now Garry Kasparov moves back to F5, which is one of the squares marked 4. White has to make a choice. He chose to go to G1. Now Kasparov moved to E5, and now white has the choice. If he moves to F2, black will follow up by moving to F4 and win the game because he gets to the key square. So Albert tried king to F1. Kasparov played king to E4, and white resigned. Let's have a look at a typical continuation. For instance, there's two continuations which make some kind of sense, right? One would be we move to the F2 square, F4 square. Now I've got to back off. Black gets in and wins the game. The other possibility would be, say, moving E1 square. Oh, sorry, annotations are gone. Advance the pawn without check. And don't promote to a queen or anything at this stage. Best thing to do might be just to rook back to F3. Checkmate. So it's very, very well done. I say this is quite a basic example, but it's a good example, right? So you got to be able to solve this one in your head and work your way through the corresponding squares. Okay, so let's move on to the next of the games I wanted to have a quick look at. Let's do the Tal-Spassky one. Here's the position. I've got this right. This is from the 1965, just PGN across so you can see it, 1965 Tbilisi candidates matches, the final match between Tal and Spassky. Spassky won this quite comfortably. Let me see if I've got the score over here somewhere. 7-4. And it's when Spassky had his first run at the World Chess Championship, lost to Petrosian in 66, came back and won it in 69. So that's the background of this. And obviously Tal, it's needs no introduction. So this is a game which Spassky won, and it's a very fascinating game because I'm going to call it corresponding squares. It's really more a triangulation, but we can sort of interpret it in the corresponding squares way. So it's a fascinating position because if you look at it, white rook is quite starved for squares. Rook protects the pawn covers that square, other pawn covers that square, rook's covering that square. So the rook only has two viable squares, E4 and H4. King cannot move because then the pawn will just push forwards. So basically, this is white's future, just moving the rook backwards and forwards between those two squares. Now, that's a problem because when you think of triangulation, it tends to be a situation like that when somebody only has one move and somebody else has a spare move that they can create. So given that sort of hint, have a look at it and see the way which black can win this according to triangulation or corresponding squares in inverted commas. While you think about that, I'll just go back to a couple of moves earlier where black played H5, which caused this sort of almost zugzwang position for white. Quickest way of winning, wasn't the only way of winning, but it was the quickest way of winning. And now let's map these out so that if the black king gets to the D3 square, attacking, call that a key square, attacking the E4 square, the white rook must be on H4. So in this position, rook to E4, and obviously king to D3 at this point makes no sense. Sorry, the annotations aren't staying up. D3, force it back. So let's mark there again, F1. And now we're just going to do, you can imagine that's the problem that white has got. Actually, black has another one. All those squares marked 2 allow black to move, and rook to D4, king to C3, rook goes back to H4. Here we are, we're at the little diagonal. And now we go to D3, and white loses. That was the last move of the game because of the triangulation. In fact, the triangulation which black did was he went to D2, and then he went to C3, and then he went back to D3, and that got white off his cycle, and then now there's no sensible move. Rook to H5 is actually best made in 13. Okay, so that was a fun little one using rooks and corresponding squares or triangulation. And now the final game I'm going to look at today is we look at this one, very famous one between Seirawan and Kasparov. It's at 1983, the Nixich tournament. I think is that the one where Kasparov hit the world stage. So you have a classic king and pawn end game. Black's definitely for choice. got a pass pawn over here, which actually binds the white king to that square, and got a weak pawn here, and we can start thinking about the corresponding squares. Now, I've been able to cobble together version of this, but it seems that this is both covered in a book by Seirawan and a book by Kasparov, and it's a very well known position. And of course, Kasparov knew exactly how to win this by the method of corresponding squares. So let's try and map these out, because I've coded up myself later on, but we'll just have a look at how this works, right? So I think we can safely say that we've got key squares on. Relax for a second. Okay, so let's map out the squares. Now, I'm going to say for starters that e5 is actually a key square. Now, probably satisfy yourself that, but let's say that the best position for the white king in that situation is king on e3. But if you look at the continuation, black just pushes b3, b2, picks up the e pawn. You can't let black get to e5. And the thing I'm going to do is let's mark out this as a pair of corresponding squares. I mean, there are different ways of doing this, but you just got to sort of think about a bit of straightforward logic to sort of almost get started on your corresponding squares. And if the white king was not on d3, let's say the white king was on e3, then black would just play and then march with his king and b pawn. And if the white king was on, let's say, c2 or d2, then black just plays king to d4, picks up the pawns and wins. So we've got a few things. We've got a key square and we've got our first square set of corresponding squares. So let's move on from that. Now, if we mark d6 as the second corresponding square, then where does white have to be? White has to be able to cover both the key square and the square marked 1. There's only one square which does that. d4. Excellent. Okay, so let's mark out another square here, square marked 3. White will have to cover squares marked 1 and 2. There's actually two choices for that, either the c4 square or the d3 square. Now, it won't make a lot of difference, but the next thing to think about is now this is where the triangulation corresponding square problem comes along. So black has two squares, which allow him to access the squares marked 2 and the squares marked 3. Let's try and find squares for that in the white camp. Remember, white cannot move outside the square, so we can't use those squares on the 5th rank. So therefore, there's only one square which lets him go to 2 and 3, and that is that square marked d3. And that's all we need to know. Basically, we'll do a triangulation. That, or maybe a triangulation going back c6 or d6, depending upon what white does. So now we can do a game continuation. So white just played f5. Kasparov moves back from c5 to c6. Game continuation. Seirawan moves to square marked 3, as we've just mapped out. He could have gone to the other square marked e3, but it amounts to the same thing because basically the same thing will happen. Kasparov drops back to c7. Now we have to go to a square marked 4 because if we get a square marked, because we need to be able to access both squares marked 2 and 3. There's only that one square marked 4, as we pointed out. Now Kasparov, he moved to the other square marked 4, so now we're on d7. And this is where Seirawan cannot answer. He moves to the square marked 3. So Kasparov moved to the square marked 3. That makes most sense. Can't really do much. We move to square marked 1 and 4. Now we move to square marked 1. And we're back to this continuation we talked about. That king to e3 is probably the most sensible. And now here's the winning line. You push the pawn, move across, and there's the winning line. You bring your king in. Now, Yasser was fighting here. He played e5. There's only one winning move here, by the way. If he takes it, then you end up with these sort of queening at the same time situations. The winning move is king to a3, and the game finished there. Because what's going to happen is that you look at the counting here. 1, 2, 3. That's okay. So the problem is we've got 1 and 2. And of course, the problem which Seirawan would have is that's check. And black wins. And it really does have a bit of that sort of pawn counting ready feel to it, right? Because white moves the tempo moving his king, then black can use tempo moving his king, and so on. So anyway, that's a really interesting example of that. And I think there was a situation. Let's just move back before. Yeah, so I saw one of the comments here. This is move 40, the last move, time control. King d4 draws the game. Take the opposition. Basically, just have good king position. And that last move of time control was a blunder, and in sort of the blogs here that Yasser Seirawan was kicking himself for doing that and drawn rather than lost this game against the coming Kasparov. I mean, if you look back at the thumbnail I used there, this is I think this was a Legends, one of those Legends sort of tournaments, a much older version of Kasparov playing Seirawan. Quite funny that, and that's a thumbnail. Okay, so wrap it up there. I hope you enjoyed those real-world examples of corresponding squares I've used, and the way you can use corresponding squares. I mean, if you come using opposition, triangulation, all that sort of stuff, that's good already. And maybe corresponding squares maybe gives you a way of checking your analysis. So if you've got time over the board, then you can quickly sort of come up with the right solution to these problems. So hope you enjoyed that, and thank you very much for watching.